That's very much the opposite of that.
That is great.
Thank you. 1, 2, 3. You guys will need to get out your number 26 book assignment for a little bit later here. But last week, I only got to see you 2 times because it was a B week. And we've got one more day of looking at section 4.5, which is the graphing sine and cosine graphs. So this morning, we're going to start off with handout 27, the handout you picked up this morning that has a bunch of graphs on it. We're going to practice graphing some more of these because I think that's probably the hardest skill within here. You've got to be able to basically do all the other question types to be able to graph. Then I'll take any of the book questions from number 26 that you had trouble finishing. You guys worked on a lot of that last class, but I don't think you had time to finish it. And so if there were some questions you had that you didn't get to in class, then I want to give you a chance to ask those. Then the other two handouts you picked up, 4.5 worksheet and 4.5 worksheet B. This is like 2 practice quizzes. So we've not done a practice quiz since section 4.2. We do it again here. So that gives you some quick feedback on if you are as prepared for it as you would like to be and what skills, if any, you need to focus more on. Then finally, I'll remind you guys to turn in some stuff in the Google Classroom. That stuff is already in there, so as those are finished, you're welcome to do that. And then, of course, you need to look over your stuff by Wednesday to study for this quiz. So, looking at the extra practice, again, this isn't anything new. It's just probably one of the harder things, at least in my opinion, is we will ask you to, you can just kind of glance at one of your practice quizzes, and you can see we do ask you to graph something like -2 sine of x plus pi over 4. And this will be a no calculator quiz because we don't want to see if you can just type it in, hit enter, and then copy that to your paper. We want to see if you understand what each of these things are doing. So, similar to how we did on the notes, you should look through here and see that the parent function is sine. So if I was you, I would lightly graph in sine. It's better if you have it memorized, but remember you can always plug a couple points into the unit circle. The sine of 0 is 0, the sine at pi over 2 is 1, the sine at pi is 0, etc. And then make one of these changes at a time. So I would say I will deal with the 2. The 2 is going to multiply all the y values by 2 compared to this one. So now it goes up to 2, down to -2, and anything that was at 0 is still at 0. Because 0 times 2 is still going to be 0. So in purple, we've got what 2 sine x would look like. At some point, you're going to have to think about the negative. So I'll do that next. The negative does not change the amplitude. The amplitude is just a length and it does not care about direction. But the negative is going to reflect it over the x-axis. So this point flipped over, this point flipped over. Anything on the x-axis stays on the x-axis. This point flips over. So in black, I've got -2 sine x. And this is where it helps if you make those first few steps kind of light. You don't want to have too much going on in your graph that you confuse yourself.
Good morning, FHS. Today is Monday, October 2nd, 2023. Please join me in a minute of silence. Please stand if you are able and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you and have a great day.
Not sure why they were so late with that, but okay. So again, in red there, I started with the parent function sign. Then I made one change, like the 2 out front, which changed the amplitude to 2. So in purple, I have 2 sign. Then I needed to make another change, which I dealt with in black. The negative flips it over the x-axis. And then finally, again, for me, this gets to be a little bit too busy, so I like to erase my previous steps. They were helpful, but they're not really helpful now. So you don't have to do that, but you probably want to make your first few steps light if you're going to do it that way. And if I know what this looks like, then I know adding to x makes it go to the left. How much it goes to the left is c divided by b. Luckily b is 1 because that makes it a little bit easier. So I need to move it left pi over 4 divided by 1. So left pi over 4. So we got to pay attention to our x-axis pretty carefully here. If 2 tick marks make pi over 2, then 1 tick mark is going to make pi over 4. So I really need to move each one of these points 1 tick mark to the left. So move this one here, left 1, just move all of the points left 1. And if you keep that previous step there, then it should look like the whole graph is just slid left a little bit. So as long as that little bit was the correct amount, then that should be what our graph looks like. As always, if you want to leave more than one thing graphed on your graph paper, that's fine, but you better label which one is your answer. You can see on your practice quiz, we do ask you to do one of these on the real quiz. And if you put 4 graphs there, I can't just guess which one I think is your final answer. You need to at least label it or make it much bolder than the rest. It needs to be super obvious which one is your answer. I can't assume the correct one is your answer. Or for that matter, you could just go back and gently erase the stuff that's not really part of your answer. Now, as you'll also see on the practice quiz, the points get divvied up based on asking you some stuff about this graph. So before we look at a second one, and hopefully this gets a little bit easier with repetition, we will ask you to name some of the x-intercepts. So x-intercepts always have a y value of 0. That's asking us to name 4 of them. And on my graph, I can see 4. I guess if my graph didn't show 4, I would be concerned that maybe I did something wrong. But label these very carefully. Remember, 1 tick mark is pi over 4. So this guy right here is negative pi over 4, 0. One of them. Let's see, pi over 2 plus pi over 4, or the average of pi over 2 and pi would be 3 pi over 4. I'm cheating a little bit thinking about unit circle. I know where pi over 2 is on the unit circle, I know where pi is on the unit circle, and I know the angle in the middle of those is 3 pi over 4. But same thing, 1/2 pi, 1 pi, the average of those, the thing in the middle. In between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi is 7 pi over 4. And then this guy, the only other one, in between negative pi and negative 3 pi over 2. Let's see, negative 1, negative 1/2. You got to be kind of careful here. I've got this, and I want to go less this much because I know it's 1 tick mark. So negative 5 pi over 4. Okay, now if there's any of these that you feel less confident on, or if you have some extra time on your quiz, which a lot of times you guys do, you could do this for all of the points, but I'm going to just do it for one. Let's say I'm feeling a little shaky about this one. I was a little shaky on naming that. I'm pretty sure I did it correctly over here. But one way that you guys can check, it doesn't guarantee that your graph is correct, but it does guarantee if your graph is wrong. If you think when x is negative 5 pi over 4, y is supposed to be 0, actually plug that in and see if it's true. If I plug in, and I'm not going to beat you over the head with this on all of these questions, but this is kind of important to at least talk about once. If I plug that in for x, if I add this is negative pi, because I know the unit circle, that is 0. So apparently when I plug in this for x, I get this for y. That confirms negative 5 pi over 4 is where it's supposed to be. Now again, it doesn't mean that the rest of the graph is right, but if plugging in negative 5 pi over 4 did not result in a y value of 0, I would know something was wrong, and at least I would know to go and try to fix it. Okay, the other thing I want you to get out of this before we move on is that the y-intercept is not always obvious. Like this looks like he's probably going through 0, negative 1. But sometimes it might go through like here, and you should not be assuming that that's a half. It could be square root of 2 over 2 or something like that. So, like you do in all algebra stuff, if you want to find a y-intercept, there's a way to do that algebraically. You can say all y-intercepts have an x value of 0. So plug in 0 for x. Solve for y. You have to know unit circle at this point. Sine of pi over 4 would be square root of 2 over 2. Those cancel. And so sure enough, even though it looked like it was at 0, negative 1, it's actually at 0, negative square root of 2. And I think as a decimal, that's actually about negative 1.4. Yeah. So my graph, even though I tried to make it pretty accurate, this should actually probably be a little bit lower, like this. And I honestly did not do that to you on purpose, but you should not assume it's going exactly through a half, or assume it's going exactly through negative 1. Don't just eyeball it, test it out algebraically. Plug in 0 for x and solve for y. Okay, any questions about the first one before we try a second? Okay, then let's look at another one together. I'll have you do try the ones on the back before we go over them, but I can do this one for you. Okay, so if you were asked to graph all of this mess, just like the last question, start as simple as possible. Look in there and see that you should be starting with a cosine graph. And just put that on your paper. Probably lightly, because that's not going to be the final answer. Then you got to think about how this stuff changes. This is why I said this is probably the hardest of the skills. If I change the b value to 2, now period is pi, because period is calculated by 2 pi over b. So instead of needing 2 pi of space to see a full cycle, I need to squeeze this into 1 pi of space to see a full cycle. But it should be the same pattern. It should still start and end at 1. It should still be at negative 1 directly in the middle. And it should go through 0 in between each of those. And if you're careful with one cycle, then you can repeat it until your graph is full. And that's what cosine of 2x would look like in purple. Changing it, the b value is going to change the frequency, change the period. Okay, I'm going to get the parent function out of the way because that was really just to help me with that. At some point, I'm going to have to deal with this minus pi over 4. I know since it says minus, that has to be to the right. And that's a bad mistake to make if you go the wrong direction. Right? But how much is not pi over 4? It's c over b. So in this question, pi over 4 divided by 2, which is pi over 8. So if all the way to the right is 2 pi, half of that is 1 pi, half of that is half of a pi, half of that is pi over 4, and half of that is pi over 8. So I need to move everything to the right half a tick mark. So bump all of these points half a tick mark to the right. Reconnect them. And with that purple piece still there, I at least did what I was aiming to do there. I was trying to bump the whole thing right, pi over 8, and I definitely bumped the whole thing right. So assuming this distance was pi over 8, it is correct. Okay, once again, for simplicity, I'm going to get the old stuff out of the way. But at this point in black, I have dealt with the 2 next to x that changed the period, and I dealt with the minus pi over 4, which created a phase shift. The last thing is this plus 1. So whether you put a plus 1 up front or a plus 1 at the end, these do the exact same thing. That is a vertical shift up 1. So obviously we just take all of our points, bump them up 1, and reconnect, and then we should be done. So again, 2 things here. This really is going to be the last skill that you feel comfortable with before the quiz, because you have to know why I know the period is pi, what the period looks like on a graph, why I shifted it right instead of left, why I shifted it right pi over 8 instead of pi over 4. You have to know all the other stuff that you practiced through the book assignment already. But in the end, that is what we are aiming for. Okay, and then some of the other stuff we may ask for. So on question 1, we ask you to find 4 x-intercepts and a y-intercept. And in this one, the second graph that we did, this one's wanting 4 relative extrema. Extrema are just max and mins. So I actually see 4 maxes, 4 relative maxes. So I need to label at least 2 of them. You can pick, there's 4 of them. Again, if my graph only had 1 or 0 maxes, I would really be concerned, how am I supposed to answer this? But at some point it was right here, and I bumped it right pi over 8. So I'm pretty sure this is pi over 8 is 0. Not 0. Pi over 8, 2. That's a relative max. Over here, this was pi, and then it got bumped right pi over 8. So pi plus pi over 8 would be 9 pi over 8. It has a y value of 2. And then for 2 minimums, there's 4 of them. So just pick out the 2 that you think look the easiest to name. I don't know, from here to here. Actually, it might be easier to just count pi over 8. But I guess over to the side, you could add your fractions. You could say pi over 2 plus pi over 8, get a common denominator and solve that. Or I could say this is 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8. This is 5 pi over 8. And then maybe I'll do the same thing and go this way. This would be negative pi over 8, negative 2 pi over 8, negative 3 pi over 8. Again, or you could say, I know it's pi over to the 8 right of negative pi over 2. So over to the side, if you want to do negative pi over 2 plus pi over 8, get a common denominator and add your fractions, you should end up with the same thing. Now again, I'm going to spare you here the checking on every single question, but what you should do on your quiz is any of these that you feel less sure about, or if you have time, all of them, plug in this x value into the function, solve for y. If you don't get 2, then your graph cannot be correct. Try plugging in this x value into the function, solve for y. If you do not get 2, then your graph cannot be correct. Maybe you went left instead of right, maybe you went the wrong amount, maybe you just named the point incorrectly, but at least you would know that something was off before you turned your quiz in. Okay, and then another y-intercept, because this is a common issue. Again, this kind of looks like it goes through 1.5. You should not be assuming that, especially with trig functions. Unit circles sometimes have a half on there as a ratio, but not always. So all y-intercepts have an x value of 0. So we don't have to answer it from the eyeball test. We can actually solve it algebraically. We can plug in 0 for x and solve for y. So, nothing that you're ever going to guess. Because this is not a real quiz and I have a calculator in front of me, I can type that in. This guy is about 1.707. That's why the graph looks like it's at about 1.5. But it's not really at 1.5, it's just close to 1.5. But don't assume that it's going exactly through the points that you expect without checking. Okay, so now that you've had a brief reminder here, why don't you take a moment and do your best to graph question 7. And I still will go over these with you, but you should try it first to see where you're getting stuck, if nothing else. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes here. Might not be quite enough time, but it should give you enough time to see where you're slowing down and where you're having issues. that was not enough time, again, that's fine, because you at least saw where you slowed down and potentially what parts you need to pay attention to. So pretty quickly here, you should start off with the sine graph, and if you memorize what sine looks like, that doesn't take but a moment. At some point, you're going to have to think about this b value being 2 and what that does to your graph. B is going to affect the period and the phase shift, if there is a phase shift. And the period is always 2 pi divided by b. So in this case, 2 pi divided by 2, or pi. And what that means is, instead of this pattern of going up, down, down, and back to where you started in 2 pi of space, I need to squeeze it into 1 pi of space. So now I still need it to go up, down, down, and back to where it started, but in the correct amount of space based on what B is. Okay, so be very careful with the first cycle. Then you can just copy and paste the pattern for the rest of your graph. But this represents, in purple, sine of 2x. Okay, and then finally, this plus means I need to shift my whole graph left. How much it goes left is not pi over 2. Sometimes it's pi over 2. But how much the phase shift is c divided by b. So pi over 2 divided by 2, which is pi over 4. And if you struggle with seeing why this is pi over 4, you're welcome to just do pi over 2 divided by 2 and then change it to multiplying by reciprocals. So left pi over 4, think about how much of a shift pi over 4 would be. That would be 1 tick mark. If 2 tick marks is pi over 2 and pi over 4 is half of that. So this point needs to move left 1 tick mark. All of the points left 1 tick mark. And that looks like the last transformation, so this is what our answer should look like. Make sure you label which one's your answer if you're going to leave more than one there, or partially erase the other ones so that I don't have to guess. Once again, if you still don't feel comfortable computing period, computing phase shift, knowing what the sine graph looks like, then you're not ready for this, but this is part of the quiz. So you got to know all that stuff before you can actually apply it. Okay, then it looks like it wants 4 x-intercepts, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. So you could pick any 4 that you think are easier, just so that we're all kind of on the same page. So let's just take the 4 that are, I guess, closest to the origin. I have already thought about 1 tick mark being pi over 4. So this must be pi over 4, 0. Directly in the middle of pi over 2 and pi would be 3 pi over 4. This is 1 tick mark to the left, so this would be negative pi over 4. And directly between negative pi over 2 and negative pi would be negative 3 pi over 4. Again, if you have time, I would recommend that you plug some of those into the function. Plug the x value into the function, solve for y, and if you don't get 0, then that is not correct. Something's wrong. Your graph's wrong, your point's named incorrectly. This one I was a little slower on, so I would check this one personally, but you should check as many that you have time for. Okay, y-intercept. If I have 2 seconds to turn my quiz in, I'm going to guess that it goes through 0, 1, and it may. But as you saw from the front page, making that assumption is going to be wrong sometime. The first 2 graphs we did, it did not go through what it looks like. So the only way to know for sure is to do it algebraically. All y-intercepts have an x value of 0. So plug in 0 for x and solve for y. It looks like when x is 0, y is 1. So this time it is exactly what it looks like. It wasn't just close to it. But assuming you know the unit circle, that's pretty easy and quick to check. Okay, any of this I'm going over too quickly, or any of it you want to ask something specific about before we practice one more? Okay, then move on to the last one here, number 10. And same thing, I'll give you several minutes here. I'll give you a couple more minutes than I did on the last one, since this is, well, I don't know. You've got a couple of these to practice on the other handouts, but still. I'll give you, like, let's say 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, if you don't have the graph done, then you're definitely stuck somewhere. Okay, it's already been 5 minutes, but I'm gonna give you another minute or two here. Looks like that might help some of you. If you're already finished, you could try to check one of your points algebraically just to make sure that you understand what I mean by that. And then there was, yes, they're still out. Okay, so that was 7 minutes total, so let's see how you did. Okay, so basically impossible to just go straight to the answer, but you should be able to start off cosine pretty quickly. That's one of our two parent functions in this section, so it's not too much to ask you to memorize that. At some point you need to think about what changing a to 2 does. That's going to change the amplitude to 2. At some point you got to think about this. Subtracting from x is going to shift it right some. How much it's going to shift it to the right is c divided by b. Pi over 3 divided by 1 would be pi over 3. And this is a little bit of an unusual amount because it doesn't match up perfectly. But pi over 3, is that more or less than pi over 2? It's less. You'd rather have half a pizza than a third of a pizza. So if I've got this point and I figured out I needed to go right pi over 3, this is pi over 4, this is pi over 2, pi over 3 is going to be somewhere about here. So basically 1.5 tick marks. Not exactly, but pretty close. Okay. So at this point, I've started with the cosine parent function. I changed the amplitude to 2, and I have dealt with the phase shift right pi over 3. And then to finish the question, again, I don't know why this is uncomfortable for students, but this -1 being on the far left, or if it's on the far right, either way, that's taking away 1 from all the y values. So this is going to shift him down 1. So shift a bunch of the points down 1, reconnect them, and then I believe what's in red should be my final answer. I need to either label it as f of x to be clear which one I think my answer is, or just erase the others. Okay, it looks like it's asking for 2 maxes and 2 relative mins. Well, there's 2 maxes to pick from, and it's asking for 2, so I don't get a choice this time. I do need to be careful about the x value, but it looks like the y value for the maxes should be 1. With very little thought. And same with the minimums, except his y value is -3, something -3. Okay, and this distance here, I believe this point was over here at some point. So I believe when I went right pi over 3, I went from 0 to pi over 3. I'm going to check that one though. And over here, I believe when I was graphing earlier, the point was at -2 pi, and then I went right pi over 3. So I don't know, I can't do that in my head. But -2 pi over 3, and then it got pi over 3 bigger. If I get a common denominator, I believe that should be -5 pi over 3. Again, I'm going to test one of these points though. I would actually test both if I was you on a quiz, but okay. For the minimums, I believe this point was at -pi, and then I went right pi over 3. So -pi, and then it got pi over 3 bigger. Puts it at -2 pi over 3. And over here, I believe this point was at pi, and then I moved it right pi over 3, so that would make it 4 pi over 3. Okay, and I told you I wouldn't beat you over the head with the checking, but as you can see, some of these, if you don't remember where they came from, it's kind of hard to know that this is pi over 3. In fact, you might think it's exactly in the middle of pi over 4 and pi over 2. But you could check any and all of these. I'm just going to show one of them. I'll test this point. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to make sure that this point is where he's supposed to be. If I plug this x value in for x, I'm hoping that it gives me a y value of 2, because that's what I'm saying with this answer. Okay, so -5 pi over 3 minus another pi over 3 would be -6 pi over 3, which reduces to -2 pi. The cosine at -2 pi is 1. So I have -1 times 2, which should be -2. And that doesn't match up, so I've got a mistake somewhere. Let me check this again. Oh, well, one thing is this is supposed to be a plus, and I wrote times here for some reason. -1 plus 2 would be 1. Okay, and then that's what I wanted. So I just had a small little arithmetic mistake. But I have just confirmed that -5 pi over 3, 1 is supposed to be on the graph. Again, it doesn't mean the rest of the graph is correct, but if that point's in the right spot, then I feel much safer. Okay, the y-intercept looks like it goes through the origin, but again, we should not assume that. Y-intercepts always have an x value of 0. And just like I did a second ago, we can plug it in and be 100% sure. We should not be estimating with our eyes. Plug in 0 for x and solve for y. Have to slow down a little bit here because of unit circle. That would be 1/2. Looks like when x is 0, y is 0. So based on my graph, that makes sense. It looks like it's going through 0, 0, and algebraically I got 0, 0. So adds a little bit more confidence to my graph. But before I give you a chance to speak up and ask questions about this last one, as I said, this would be kind of the last thing that you feel super comfortable with. If you don't know the difference between sine and cosine, you have to memorize those. You have to know why this shifts this down 1. You have to know why this changes the amplitude to 2, what the amplitude is visually, why this shifts it right, why is it shifting it right pi over 3. You got to be able to know all of that and execute it to be able to get some of these points in the right spot. So before we put this practice aside, is there anything about 10, 11, or 12 you'd like to ask? Okay, then next thing on our agenda here is I want to give you a chance to ask the book questions that you did not have time to get to when I saw you last Wednesday. And if you don't have any book questions, or while someone's asking a question that you don't need help with, you can go ahead and start on number 28. The first one just says section 4.5 worksheet in the top left. You should do it first. And again, it's like a practice quiz, so please use it as a practice quiz. Try it without hints, without a calculator, without your notes. See how many of those you feel comfortable with. See which ones you're less comfortable with. Check your answers with the solutions online. If you're happy with how you did, that's great. Try again on the second one, worksheet B. Do the same exact thing. If you're still happy with how you did, that's great. You probably just need to review for 5 or 10 minutes, but if you're not happy with how you did, if it was the real quiz, then you at least know what question types to look back at. And I'm not going to harp on this too much, but as you guys have seen in our first test now, when we get to our second test, similar to the first test, it's going to be a lot like the quizzes from 4.4, 4.5, and 4.6. So just kind of thinking ahead a little bit here, the better and more prepared you are for this quiz means you're going to get a slightly better quiz grade, but also when we get close to the test, it would be that much less you need to study for the test. So, but you should expect this stuff to be about 1/3 of your second test when we get there. Okay, so for those of you that still have book questions from handout 20 or number 26 in your binder, go ahead and tell me what you've got. Otherwise, you can be starting on a practice quiz.
You do 47.
Sure. Okay, everyone check 47 real quick. If it will help you to follow along, then please do. And if you're good, tune me out and do the practice quiz. All right, this question wants us to sketch the graph and include 2 full periods. All right, well, before I even start to sketch this graph, kind of like what we did a minute ago, I'm going to have to recognize what the parent function is. I'm going to have to recognize that this value d means it's going up to, at some point I have to shift it up to. Because there's a value for b, that's going to change the period. Period is 2 pi divided by b. So at some point, I've got to change the period to be 1/3. But it looks like that's the only 2 transformations. So if we start off graphing the cosine graph, just throwing the parent function down real quick. I could deal with this +2. I know it's going to shift all the points up 2. Of course, this is a touch easier on graph paper, but so this represents cosine x +2, and then because there's 6 pi in for b, that means that the period is 2 pi divided by that, so the period is supposed to be 1/3 and period is how often it's going to repeat itself. So I think a bad idea would be to do this. Sometimes this is a good idea, but not on this question. If you know this is 2 pi, half of that is 1 pi. Pi as a decimal is about 3.14, so about a third of this is roughly 1 pi. Not 1 pi, or I'm sorry, not 1 pi, 1 radian. This is about 3.14 radians. A third of that is about 1 radian. So 1/3 of that would be even less. So I do not want to try to squeeze this pattern into about this much of space. So mathematically, the power that we have that makes this a lot easier is I have total control over this, the x-axis. It doesn't have to go right 2 pi and left 2 pi. I can just say, here's 0, here is where 1/3 radian is, and here is where negative 1/3 radian is. Now my graph has a period of 1/3 radian without me trying to reinvent the wheel there. Your x-axis can be any terms that you want, whatever's convenient. Doesn't have to be in terms of pi even. And then of course, I need to be clear which one of those two is my answer. So be able to calculate the vertical shift and the period, and then make those changes to the cosine graph. Okay, anything more specific about 47? Anybody else that was going to ask about 47 have something else before it goes away? All right, what else from the book?
You do 69.
Okay, question 69 gives us a graph, so I'll do my best to sketch that. Pi. Okay, so that's a pretty bad sketch there, but hopefully it's enough for what we need. And the directions there, they say that I started with the sine graph. So that part's important, that it started as a sine graph and not a cosine graph. And they are expecting me to determine what A, B, and C would have to be for our graph to look like that. Okay, so A comes from the amplitude. So it looks like if there's a max value of 3 and a min value of -3, you're going to be tempted to say that the amplitude is 6. But amplitude is half the distance between min and max. So A is either 3 or -3. Because the amplitude's half the absolute value of A. Now, the way that I'm going to suspect that this is -3 is because generally the sine graph starts going through the origin like this. This is what the sine graph looks like. He goes through the origin, but going up instead of down. So to me, it seems like it's been reflected over the x-axis. And that's why I would say A is -3. Doesn't change that the amplitude's still 3. Okay, B is going to affect the period. So 2 pi divided by B is what gives me the period. And because I have a graph, I can measure the graph's period. If I take a point and then I see how far I have to go before the graph starts to repeat. That looks like that 0 to pi, so the period would be pi. So if you set the period formula equal to what you want the period to be, you could multiply both sides by b, divide both sides by pi, and it looks like b should be 2. And then for the phase shift, see, that one's always the hardest for me. So I would probably just lightly sketch in the stuff that I'm sure about. Here's sine. There's 3 sine. Try to get the rest of this mess out of there. There's negative 3 sine. Oh, I probably shouldn't have erased the original graph. With b being 2, I need to squeeze this pattern in. So that. And then if I'm trying to look at the original graph here, it looks like it's okay, so I would be tempted to say that C is 0. I don't think it's being shifted right or left at all. But that'd be a little bit easier to see if I had not messed up my graph. Let me see what the back of the book goes with. Yep, they also got C was 0. So at the end there, because I had erased what I thought I was starting with, I was having to look at the book. But this looks exactly the same as the book, so I'm pretty sure it's not shifting it right or left. That's how I said C was 0. I'd say the trickiest part of that would be the negative on the A, seeing that they flipped it over the x-axis. And just to be clear, when you make up an equation, you can choose whether you want to make A negative or not. So we could have also had this be positive 3 for A, but then we would have had a different value for C, and it still could have been correct. So just like all these graphs could be sine or cosine, either one's fine, but one of them usually needs a phase shift and one of them probably doesn't need a phase shift. That one was tough. Okay. Other book questions to finish up your homework? Okay, then let me say one thing about this practice quiz, and then I'll give you guys some time to look at it. And then I'll ask you some questions here in a bit once I think everyone's had time to try it. Just so you guys know, there is, and this is different than what I've said before, but some people prefer this, and I think you'll see why by the end of it, especially when you check your answers. So you can write this equation 1 like this, but some people prefer to factor b out. So take this GCF and put it out here, like so. And the reason why, that's going to change this. Oops. Now if I distribute 1/2 to x, I get 1/2 x, which is what it's supposed to be. And then if I distribute 1/2 to 4 pi over 5, it's 2 pi over 5. So you don't have to write it like this at all. But do you see how this 1/2 is just being factored out front? Okay, go ahead and try question 1 so I can say why some people prefer to write it this way. So for question 1, even if you just now did it, hopefully that was enough time. Now, if you're struggling with any of these, add to it as you look at your notes. Amplitude is the absolute value of A, and you have to know where A is. Period. Comes from 2 pi over B, and you have to know where B is. So 2 pi divided by a half go out to the side and change it to multiplying if you need to. That would be 4 pi. The phase shift, you do have to state whether it's right or left. There's a big difference between going right an amount and left an amount, but if you're subtracting, it goes right. Not intuitive with what we do in number lines, but is consistent with what transformation rules you used in Algebra 2. But how much? You have to have this formula memorized, C over B. So 2 pi over 5 divided by pi over 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 2, which is 4 pi over 5. And then vertical shift, if you want to call it a formula, would be the D value. D could be at the front or the end. That's if you're adding or subtracting something. And this one doesn't have any. Does not have a D value, so there is no vertical shift. Obviously, you need to say none. If you leave it blank, it looks like you don't know. So, I'm going over this one, even though nobody asked, because why do you think some people might prefer to write it like this one in red? Do you see how one of these is a lot easier if you write it this way? Which one? Right, the phase shift, it's already had, this is already C divided by B. By factoring out that 1/2, it makes it easy to see what that's going to be. If you don't factor out the 1/2, that's fine. You do C divided by B, you get the same answer. But if B is already factored out, then your phase shift is staring at you right there. So that's why some people prefer to write it that way. You do not have to write it that way if you don't want to. But I think maybe on the last question, when you check your answers, you may see that they chose to do that. All of that, I believe, just a heads up, I'm pretty sure we have on the quiz, one of the questions looks like this. But again, if this bugs you that this 1/2 is out here, I'm not a fan of this because you guys know you can't put a 1/2 here if you use a calculator. If this bugs you, then you can just take one step, distribute the 1/2, distribute the 1/2, and then you can work it like that. So if you get a question that has B value factored out, you're welcome to just distribute it back if you prefer to look at it like that. But these two things are saying the same thing. Those two are equal. Okay, so now I will shut up and let you guys focus for a few minutes. So go ahead and try it, see how you do. As you finish, check the answers online. Circle the questions you might want to ask about. And once I think you've had time to finish this first one, I will answer those for you. So about, I don't know, about 12 minutes from now. We're getting down to about 10 minutes of class here, so if you have some you'd like me to talk over with you, you need to start letting me know. So again, there's a worksheet B also that goes with the same binder number. Both of these make up number 28, but it's just the second time to practice, so anything you're struggling with from this one, I call this worksheet A. It doesn't say worksheet A, but you're probably going to have the same problem on worksheet B. So only 5 questions here. So which of these would you like to discuss? Any of them seem harder than the others? Yeah. Number 2? Okay. Better than that, I'll just do all 4 of them. So for all of these questions, you need to know where A, B, C, and D are. A is the coefficient of the trig function, B is the coefficient of x, C is what you add or subtract to x, and D is the number that you add or subtract to the whole thing. Again, you guys are used to having like a +7 on the end, but it could be out here. The formulas you have to know are super basic, but if you don't know one of them, it's going to cause a lot of issues. Amplitude, absolute value of A, period 2 pi divided by B. Phase shift, you have to tell me whether it's going right or left, and it is C divided by B. So I would write it like this. This is C divided by B, which is the same thing as multiplying by 1/6. So I end up with pi over 18. And then vertical shift is D. If it's positive, it's going up. If it's negative, it's going down. So was it just this one? Yeah. Yeah, make sure like pi over 3 divided by 6. You don't have to do that in your head. Just write it out like that and change it to multiplying by the reciprocal. It's a lot easier. So as long as you're not having to graph it, questions 1 and 2 should be pretty straightforward. Know what A, B, C, and D are, and know what those 4 formulas are that are highlighted. And that's all you need for the first 2. All right, somebody else have another one?
You did 3.
Okay, so in all of this, it looks like the parent function is sine. I'm going to call this 2 pi and this pi. If you go all the way right for 2 pi, then the little tick marks are kind of hard to adjust for. It puts pi in an uneven spot. But sine looks like this. At some point, you got to think about what, if A is not 1, what that's going to do. It's going to change the amplitude to 2. So instead of going up to 1 and down to -1, it's going up to 2 and down to -2. And because there's a C value, that is going to be a phase shift right, and that's a big one. If you go left, you're going to miss all these points, and it's going to look really confusing for a second. Right, C over B, but since B is 1, it's just going to be pi over 2. So think about how much pi over 2 is. Take all those points, shift right pi over 2, right pi over 2, right pi over 2, and my guess is why this is probably why they made that extra tick mark to the right and left, so that when you moved it, it would still fit on there kind of nicely. So that's what I think Y looks like. All right, you okay with that part? Okay, then I want you to label all the relative extrema. So that would be the maxes and the mins. So this one looks to be at pi, this one looks to be at negative pi, this one looks to be at negative 2 pi, this one looks to be at 0, this one looks to be at 2 pi. Wants me to label all the x-intercepts. So in between pi and 2 pi would be 3 pi over 2. In between 0 and pi would be pi over 2. So this would be negative pi over 2. Negative 3 pi over 2. See, pi over 2 plus pi over 2 would be 2.5 or 5 pi over 2. And this one would be in the other direction, so that should be negative 5 pi over 2, 0. And the y-intercept, I guess if I was out of time on my quiz, I would just hope that this was correct. But again, just like we talked about in the last handout, you should not do that unless you have to. Actually plug in that x value, solve for that y value. You get 2 times negative 1, which is exactly negative 2. And any of the others that you feel unsure about or want to feel more confident about your graph, you can check. Plug in the x value into the function, solve for y. If it doesn't match up with the y value, then something's wrong. I don't think I would check all of those points because that would take a while, but checking a couple of them would go a long way for your confidence. Okay, we are down to about 3 minutes here, so we do need to find a stop in place. Obviously, for homework, you need to make sure you have your stuff turned in to Google Classroom. And based on these practice quizzes, you should know what to study and look over. But we will start class on Wednesday with 4.5 quiz. And it will be no calculator.